All right, guys, welcome back to another episode. In this lesson, we're actually going to be talking about share structures. It's going to be kind of an overview lesson because we're going to go in depth a little bit further this week probably about how share structures can be changed by orders of court orders or by reverse splits and stuff like that. So kind of understanding what the authorized shares, the outstanding shares, and the float all mean. I kind of want to give you guys a good overview lesson before we start digging a little bit into that. And market cap, we're going to have a lesson on market cap as well. But I'm going to go ahead and get started. Authorized shares versus outstanding shares, an overview. Understanding stock market terminology allows investors to make appropriate, intelligent decisions as it relates to company stocks. Knowing the difference between authorized shares and outstanding shares is relevant in accurately calculating important ratios that speak to the financial stability of a company. Authorized shares, also known as authorized shares or authorized capital stock, are defined as the maximum number of shares that a company is legally allowed to issue to investors as per its own determinations. The maximum number is established in a company legal formation documents known as the Articles of Incorporation. There is no limit as to the total number of shares that can be authorized within these documents for a larger company, while smaller companies that do not plan to expand or that have a set number of shareholders are limited to the number of authorized shares that they designate. For a company that does not have an authorized share reduction or restriction, the Articles of Incorporation may authorize one share or millions of shares. Important, the number of authorized shares can be changed by way of a vote from shareholders, typically during the annual shareholder meeting. The number of shares actually available to trade is known as float. There are also restricted shares which are set aside for employees, compensation, incentives. Restricted shares are also part of authorized shares. The total number of companies' outstanding shares, as seen in the balance sheet, is the sum of float and restricted shares. So just give you guys a little example. Go to security settings, okay? So let's say you go to security settings on OTC markets. You're going to see the market cap. Then you're going to see the authorized shares. This is the total amount of shares this company is willing to or able to give its shareholders. And so far, they've given 230 million shares to its shareholders, but 35 million of those are restricted, and only 195 million of those are unrestricted, which equals to the float, so to speak. Understanding shares outstanding. Okay, I gotta read here. Shares that are issued or sold to investors from the available number of authorized shares are known as outstanding shares. The number of outstanding shares is set by the investment bank that implements the company's initial public offering, or IPO. But the number can change. A secondary stock market offering can increase the number of outstanding shares, as can payment of employee stock options. Outstanding shares decrease when a company repurchases its own stock. The number of outstanding shares cannot be greater than the total number of authorized shares as laid out in the company's Article of Incorporation. For investors, understanding the difference between authorized and outstanding shares allows for more accurate calculations of financial ratios. For instance, using outstanding shares to determine earnings per share, EPS, could result in inflated gains, while using authorized shares may drastically offset a realized loss. Investors should have a strong understanding of these underlying terms in order to make correct calculations on a company's financial stability and performance. Understanding shares outstanding. Any authorized shares that are held by or sold to a corporation's shareholders exclusive of treasury stock, which is held by the company itself, are known as outstanding shares. In other words, the number of shares outstanding represents the amount of stock on the open market, including shares held by institutional investors and restricted shares held by insiders and company officers. A company's outstanding shares can fluctuate for a number of reasons. The number will increase if the company issues additional shares. Companies typically issue shares when they raise capital through an equity financing or upon exercising employee stock options, ESO, or other financial instruments. Outstanding shares will decrease if the company buys back its shares under a share repurchase program. Key takeaways. Shares outstanding refer to a company's stock currently held by its shareholders, including share blocks held by institutional investors and restricted shares owned by the company's officers and insiders. A company's number of shares outstanding is not static and may fluctuate widely over time. How to locate the number of outstanding shares. In addition to listing outstanding shares at capital stock on the company balance sheet, publicly traded companies are obligated to report the number of issued and outstanding shares and generally package this information within the investors relations section of their website or on local stock exchange websites. In the United States, the figures for outstanding shares are accessible from the Securities and Exchange Commission (SEC) quarterly filings. So let's say you go to a play here and this is not updated, okay? You see nowhere that this is updated. It's always good to go back to their quarterly filings and try to find this information updated. Of course, you're going to have to read through it here and find them. But also, I think they may post them in 10Ks as well. I'm not going to read through this long thing to find it. But yeah, going through their filings will find you those shares as well if they're not updated, or you can request them through the SEC website as well, or a TA, the transfer agent. And I think for actually contact information for a transfer agent, is it on the front page here? I'm not sure if it's on the front page here, or maybe it's under company. Service providers, it's their accounting firm. Generally, other than service providers, they do have a TA agent that you can call. They'll have a phone number and everything. Doesn't look like it's updated here on the OTC markets. Stock splits and share consolidation. The number of shares outstanding will increase if a company undertakes a stock split, or will reduce if it's undertaking a reverse stock split. Stock splits are usually undertaken to bring the share price of a company within the buying range of retail investors. The increase in the number of outstanding shares also improves liquidity. Conversely, a company will generally embark on a reverse split or share consolidation to bring its share price into the minimum range necessary to satisfy an exchange listing requirements. Now, you'll have some of these stocks, let's say they're trading at literally micro pennies, okay, just really cheap, and they want to uplist to OTCQB, which the minimum required for OTCQB is 1 penny, okay? So when the stock falls below a penny within 30 days, it cannot uplist to QB. But let's say they want to do a reverse split, then all of a sudden they can uplist to OTCQB, and it attracts a whole new range of buyers, okay, a whole new range of investors. These penny plus players, they won't play micro pennies like I like to do, but they want to play QB stocks and stocks that have, price range over that penny mark. So in order to attract a whole new buying range, a whole new buying sector, that's their way of hurting shareholders that are in micro pennies, but expanding to the penny range, thinking it's going to be more attractive. It's all about making that price per share attractive. When a CEO has a cheap stock share, it's kind of disappointing to them because they think it's so cheap and nobody's wanting it, and it's the reason for its way down there. It's not attractive in their opinion. Sometimes they will cancel, kind of like we just saw T-Cell do a reverse split cancellation. Conversely, a company will generally embark on reverse splits or share consolidation to bring its share price into the minimum range necessary to satisfy an exchange listing requirements, like the QB. While the lower number of outstanding shares may hamper liquidity, it could also deter short sellers, since it will be more difficult to borrow shares for short sales. As an example, the online video streaming service Netflix announced a 7-for-1 stock split in 2015 in an attempt to increase the affordability of its stock and concurrently number investors. Netflix increased its issuance of outstanding shares 7-fold, thus drastically reducing stock price. So this is a 7-for-1 stock split. That, I guess you could call that a forward split. It's not a reverse split. And so in that sense, that every 7 shares you had got splitted down to 1 share. Okay. So let's say you had 7,000 shares after the stock split. Now you've got 1,000 shares. Am I saying that right? No, it's up. A reverse split would be that way. So blue chip stocks. For blue chip stocks, the increased number of shares outstanding due to share splits over a period of decades accounts for the steady increase in its market capitalization and concomitant growth in investor portfolios. Of course, merely increasing the number of outstanding shares is no guarantee of success. The company has to deliver consistent earnings growth as well. While outstanding shares are determinant of a stock's liquidity, the latter is largely dependent on its share float. A company may have 100 million shares outstanding, but its 95 million of these shares are held by insiders and institutions. The float of only 5 million may constrain the stock's liquidity. Now, as you notice in OTC, there is a lot of stocks with a massive spread. RNGC is kind of one that we were just talking about tonight. It's got a tiny float. So the spread is just massive. That means a lot of shares are held. Yet you want to look at that unrestricted share mark being 195 million, but you don't know how many of that 195 million is actually held. The play today, NovM, I think it is. Okay, this play has a tiny little 57 mil float. But you know what? When you start digging through the filings, which filings was it? Maybe it was the annual reports. The CEO is actually holding 20 million of those shares. So when you've got a good share structure on a play, you're going to want to go look. You automatically you're going to think it's that share float. But when you start looking through the filings and start reading up on the latest filings drop, and this one actually dropped some filings here on the 8/11. Oh, that was yesterday, Sunday. So it did get a little spike today. I did have it on my watch list today too for those filings drop. It did run. I think it got close to a penny. Yeah, I think it got 97. And it opened up at, I think it was around 69, 60, somewhere around there. It hit 97. But it was off a tiny little volume because it has such a tiny little float, meaning that there's only, you're only dealing with roughly 37 million float. Okay, there's 37 million shares available for investors to trade because 20 mil block of this is held by the CEO. So it's not being sold or flipped around into the market. That's kind of why you see some of these stocks that we call have a float lock, so to speak. A lot of investors are determined to see the stock price really skyrocket. So they hold their shares on for dear life, and they can make actually a play with a big float. There's enough investors on it. They can even make a play with a big float, make some pretty impressive moves. DCGD is one in particular. That play should never have ran as big as it has on the float that it has. It's got 36 mil float, and hell, this thing almost hit $1 the other day. But there's so many people that have bought this play from so cheap, and this float is so locked. There's so many people that are holding a ton of the shares, meaning there could be literally, there could be just 10 million shares floating between the price movement. Who knows? So it becomes a tiny float the more shareholders hang on to their shares, and of course not taking profits, and they're just hanging on for dear life. And that's why you see a lot of these pumpers on Twitter will tell you, do not sell your shares. This thing is going to yada yada, $300. It's going to $400. So keep that in mind, that the shares do lock. If you know of a group that's getting on a play, I know PFMS was one A lot of people were kind of riding onto it to kind of lock the float because it's so tiny. And yet you guys see how thin it trades. I think there's literally like, hell, 10 million, 15, maybe 20 million after today. That's kind of free floating around now. There's not many shares available to trade on it. You've either got to slap the ass to get in or bid sit and wait for a dump. It becomes a very thin trade and very low, constrains the stock's liquidity. Share repurchase program. Oftentimes, if a company considers its stock to be undervalued, it will institute a repurchase program. And this is very attractive. I think VYST did this. I think they did $100,000 worth of share buyback, rebuy. They bought $100,000 of their own shares, and automatically it becomes attractive to investors as well that, hey, this company is actually buying some of their shares back from the open market, and they become restricted. Buying back shares of its own stock in an effort to increase the market value of remaining shares and elevate overall earnings per share. The company may reduce the number of shares outstanding by repurchasing them or buying back those shares, thus taking them off the market. Take, for example, Apple Incorporated, whose outstanding securities have a large institutional ownership of 62%. In March 2012, Apple announced a buyback program, several times since renewed at upwards of $90 billion, according to the New York Times. The primary purpose of the repurchase will be to eliminate the shareholder dilution that will occur from the future. Apple employs equity grants and stock purchase program due to its enormous cash reserves. Apple has been able to repurchase its stock aggressively, thus decreasing shares outstanding, increasing its earnings per share. As of December 2015, Apple's market cap is $869 billion, and it has a 5.18 billion outstanding shares. That's a massive amount of outstanding shares. The stock price is up nearly $170 since the buyback program was announced. Okay, this is back in 2015. Things have changed since then. Conversely, in May 2015, BlackBerry Ltd. announced it planned to repurchase 12 million of its own outstanding shares in an effort to increase stock earnings. BlackBerry plans to buy back 2.6% of its more than 500 million outstanding float shares to increase its equity incentive. Unlike Apple, whose excessive cash flow allows the company to spend exuberantly to bring its future earnings, BlackBerry's dwindling growth suggests that its repurchase of outstanding shares comes in preparations for its cancellation. Weighted average of outstanding shares. Since the number of outstanding shares is incorporated into key calculations of financial metrics such as earnings per share, because of this number is so subject to variation over time, the weighted average of outstanding shares is often used in its stead in certain formula. For example, say a company with 100,000 shares outstanding decides to perform a stock split, thus increasing the total amount of shares outstanding to 200,000. The company later reports earnings of $200,000. To calculate earnings per share for the overall inclusive time period, the formula would be as follows. Net income, dividends, or preferred stock, 200,000. Outstanding shares, 100,000 to 200,000. But it remains unclear which of the two variant outstanding share values to incorporate into the equation, 100,000 or 200,000. The former would result in an EPS of $1, while the latter would result in an EPS of $2. In order to account for this inevitable variation, financial calculations can more accurately employ the weighted average of outstanding shares, which is figured as follows. Outstanding shares times reporting period A plus outstanding shares times reporting period B. In the above example, the reporting period were each half of a year, the resulting weighted average of outstanding shares would be equal to 150,000. Thus, in revisiting the EPS calculation, $200,000 divided by the 150,000 weighted average of outstanding shares would equal $1.33 in earnings per share. Shares outstanding versus floating stock. Floating stock is a narrow way of analyzing a company's stock by shares. It excludes closely held shares, which are stock shares held by company insiders or controlling investors. These types of investors typically include officers, directors, and company foundations. Like I was just saying, you know, you've got your authorized, and then you've got your outstanding shares. Okay. And now you've got your float, which in this case, there is no float available. but unrestricted, okay? I repeat that, unrestricted of the OS becomes your float. Low float is typically an impediment to active trading. This lack of trading activity makes it difficult to enter exit positions in stocks that have limited float. The amount of a company's floating stock may rise or fall over time. This occurs because, may sell additional shares to raise more capital, or restricted or closely held shares may come available. On the flip side, a share buyback decreases the number of outstanding shares, so floating shares as a percentage of outstanding stock will go down. A stock split will increase floating shares. A reverse stock split will decrease the float. Why floating stock is so important. A company's float is an important number for investors because it indicates how many shares are actually available to be bought and sold by the general investing public. A company is not responsible for how shares within the float are traded by the public. This is a function of the secondary market. Therefore, shares that are purchased, sold, or even shorted by investors do not affect the float because these actions do not represent a change in the number of shares available for trade. They simply represent a redistribution of shares. Similarly, the creation and trading of options on a stock do not affect the float. Example of floating stock. In April 2019, General Electric GE had 8.71 billion shares outstanding. Of this, 0.016% were held by insiders, 58.64% were held by large institutions. Therefore, a total of 58.8%, 5.12 billion, is likely not available for public trading, according to the data from Thomson Reuters. The floating stock is therefore 3.59 billion shares out of the 871 total OS because 512 is locked up. It is important to know that institutions don't hold a stock forever. The institutional ownership number will change regularly, although not always by a significant percentage. Falling institutional ownership coupled with a falling share price could signal that institutions are dumping the shares. Increasing institutional ownership shows that institutions are accumulating shares. Okay, so that gives you guys kind of an overview about the AS, the OS, and the float. You know, a lot of you new guys don't understand this coming into a chat room or coming into trading world that, you know, what is the SS? The SS stands for the share structure. Okay, that's what we mean by the SS. It's the share structure. And within that share structure, we start talking about the AS, which is the authorized shares, knowing that is the maximum amount of shares this company can distribute to its traders. The outstanding shares is the actual shares into the public world, which is pretty much all of them that they've allowed. They've literally almost maxed out the total amount they can give to the public world. And restricted, they have 213 million of those restricted, causing only a 36 mil float to be available to the public trading. So this restricted, sometimes, like we were just talking about, institutional investors that own some of this stuff can sell off of these in a period of time, which can feel like dilution, so to speak. So when these actually come off, they do have expiration dates to where people will sell off their blocks or sell off their periods of shares that they're holding in the restricted zone back to the unrestricted zone. And it makes this even larger and less tight of a float. We like these low floats, okay? You start going to plays like this, for example. Yes, it's down at this price for a reason. They've got a 6 billion authorized shares, and they've got a 3.3 billion outstanding shares. Yeah, we don't see the float here. What's another one? Yeah, here we go. 20 billion authorized shares. Yeah, it's a stop sign. It's harder for them to dilute unless they get a private broker or something. But it shows that they have an outstanding shares of 5.4 billion outstanding shares, while apparently there's a roughly 1 billion in restricted that doesn't show here, leaving about 4.4 billion unavailable or unrestricted, giving it a 4.491 billion public float, which is massive. I mean, that's huge, okay? the bigger this number is, the more likelihood it's going to take a ton more money to kind of come out of this range. So why would you want to throw a bunch of money in a cheap play? Obviously, it's cheap for a reason. I can buy 20 million of the shares off of just $2,000. Why wouldn't I? Right? Not exactly. You don't want to just throw a bunch of money and buy 20 million shares of a no bid stock just because it's cheap. Okay. And you're like, oh, it could go to 2 and I could sell at 2 and get $2,000 for my $2,000 invested, 100% gain. Well, there's the likelihood that it will never go to 2 or never be able to sell to 2. You got that big ass float. It's so hard to move because it takes a ton more interest, a ton more money to make it move. Even looking back at Live, it's still tinier than that, but it's still massive. It's all it can do to run between 1 and 2, and 2 does not run very strongly. It's at 3.3. You want to start looking at the charts on some of these plays. You want to have that nicer share structure to simply do what it's going to do. Now, Live did make him move back in February. He did get some interest there. But obviously, it's dead to nothing here. Here you see no bid to 1. And now they canceled the reverse split that they were going to do. That's what caused this huge droppage here. And now it's trading between this 1 and 2, which looks like it's not really – it's hard to say what it's doing. It's more red than green here. Obviously more red bars than green bars. So you got to be careful about that kind of stuff, just buying into a no-bid play. Some people do it. I very, very carefully ever consider doing it. I have to really know that something's legit coming. And even still, I kind of want to see gratitude. It's like buying a play that's dead. Literally, it's just dead. There's nothing to it. The play has just died off immensely. There's no reason. There's no interest in it. There's nobody buying the play. So you're buying a complete dead play in hopes of it going up. We did play ELTZ. That was the last no-bid stock I ever played. It's got a tight share structure, but as you can see, its past history does not show huge moves at all. And obviously, it's sitting at no bid. Did get some volume bars, so it's back up here to 1. So no bid to 1. And very, very rarely, last time it saw 2 was in May. So you want to buy no bid. The last time it saw 2 was in May. It's not very strong to be able to sell 2. So choose your plays carefully. That's why I looked as soon as I see a play. Let's just say I'm sitting here. All of a sudden, I get an 8K that drops. I want to dig into that 8K to see if it's worth a trade. Right away, I'm going to look at the share structure. I know it's got that much authorized. It's got this much outstanding. Doesn't give me a float or unrestricted, but I know it's got at least that or less in the float. Generally less because sometimes they don't show. And of course, you want to see the freshest date. If you see an old date, it gives you questions, but you want to see that fresh date. So use your share structures. Don't just be blindly buying a play without, yes, and you want a strong catalyst. You want to know what the catalyst is, and it's important to, be aware of the catalyst, like we were talking about in our earlier lessons of understanding the 10 Qs, 10Ks, and 8Ks, and the news drops, the different news dropping catalysts. It's important to know that stuff, but ultimately it comes down to that share structure. And as soon as I find a play, right away, I'm going to be digging up here on OTC markets to find that share structure I like. And as you become more advanced, you're going to be more comfortable with certain share structures. Obviously, the tighter share structures, the thinner the play will be. I'll just do HZHI. That's one I know recently. It's got a tiny share structure. Very thin play, okay? The bid literally sits, as you see here, at 51 and the ask at 71. I mean, that's a massive 20-cent difference. You know, you imagine having 20 cents change on one buy or one sell on one stock. It's because it has a tiny OS, only 49 million shares in the OS completely. And what do you know? There's 49,231,000 restricted, leaving only 498,000 shares to trade publicly. So let's say you slap this crazy thing for 20,000, 50,000, 100,000 shares. You've already got 20%, 25% of the float just like that. It's crazy. Don't take long to own an entire float. So I'll probably have a lesson on position size. I know you guys are going to need that one for sure. I'm writing that down. Position sizing. So you guys will better understand as soon as you see a play's price according to its share structure, according to the catalyst, you're going to determine how big or how small you need to get into that play. So you've got to be very careful about how large you go into some of these plays, because last thing I want you guys doing is throwing a bunch of money in a very tiny SS play, and it goes up one tick, and man, you're excited. It made a 20-cent jump, and it could go down a 20-cent jump, and you're crying your pants off because you can't sell it. I mean, the whole goal is to buy a play to sell it. So understanding these share structures is very crucial of how large or how small you need to be getting into a play, and knowing the volume. I'm going to have lessons on volume too. I want you guys to understand volume equates to everything. A volume and how small the share structure equates to everything on position size. Not just because you got a free $5,000 sitting in your portfolio and you're just itching to spend it on the next play. You're going to jump into a play because the catalyst looks really good, or someone tells you the catalyst looks really good, and you have no clue what the share structure is. You have no clue what the average volume is. So we'll have that on a further lesson, but that's good. Covers what I had for you guys for tonight. If you guys got any questions, feel free to holler at me. I'll be here, and hope you guys have a good night.